Okay, maybe at this point we could turn to the audience for another question. A quick question, please. Maybe someone from the back, a little bit. Not too back.
From
So-
you oppressed people at the back.
Hi, Jordan. My question is, what is the antidote towards toxic masculinity?
Well, the antidote is responsible masculinity. And what does responsible mean? It means, well, if you're responsible, then you're trying to do what's honest first. So you're careful with your speech and your actions. You're careful with your speech in that you don't say things that you know to be false. And you're careful in your actions so that you don't have to lie about what you do. That's a good start. And then the next thing would be that you're capable of taking responsibility for yourself at least, so that once you're an adult, no one else has to bend over backwards to ensure that you don't unduly suffer in the world. And so that's responsibility for yourself. And then if you get halfway good at that, well then, you might think about taking on the responsibility of a family and contributing to your community and doing all those things in a harmonious manner. And that's obviously the antidote to toxic masculinity, which is not a phrase I would generally use. I just think about it as, what would you call it? I think sinful behavior is a much more accurate representation personally, but it's honesty and responsibility. And I do think about it as a function of harmony. I got that a lot from reading Jean Piaget, whose work was a psychological extension of Kant's categorical imperative, because Kant believed that you should act in a manner such that if the way you acted became a universal, that would be beneficial. But Piaget formalized that very nicely, showing that one of the bases for the emergence of a system of genuine ethics was an iterable form of reciprocity, so that, so for example, I can give you a quick example of that. My granddaughter, who's now 15 months old, has discovered a new game, and it's a Piagetian game, a developmental game, and she discovered this by watching, but also on her own, and partly because it's a very deep part of human nature. So she has this little wooden spoon, and her game is, you sit with her at the table, and her game is, she gives you the spoon, and then you take it, and then you give it back, and then she's all happy about that, and then she gives the spoon to the person who's sitting beside her, and then they give it back to her, and she's very happy about that. And so it's an amazing game, because she's learned to give up something, to let go of something that she wants, and to trust someone else to return it to her, and that's what she's playing with. And then you can play with that game. It's quite fun. So, and you have to pay careful attention to her and watch how she's manifesting her emotions. And so maybe what you do is you take the spoon and you hide it under your hand. That sort of disconcerts her a bit. Then you show it to her and pick it up and give it to her, and she's happy about that, because what she sees is that the principle of reciprocity can maintain itself across a set of transformations, and that's really exciting to her. Or you can give her the spoon, and she can give it back to you, and then she can reach for it, and you can pull it away 1/4 inch, and that sort of disconcerts her, and then she'll... Do you want to repeat that?
I'm sorry. I said that didn't cover really a toxic masculinity, right? Because
yes, it's dealing with dealing with the principle of reciprocity.
You just said that you have to be honest and responsible as a man, right?
Well, put it this way. When I'm giving the spoon back to my granddaughter, I'm not engaging in toxic masculinity. And that was the point that I was trying to make, is that, and this deep reciprocity and trust is part of the social contract, and it is precisely the antidote to what precisely, since we're going to pursue this, what precisely is toxic masculinity, as opposed to, say, toxic femininity or toxic humanity? What exactly are you asking me about?
Well, I really want to know what you like, how you would describe toxic masculinity. Because
no, I want you to define what toxic masculinity constitutes. Since we're going to define things so carefully, let's do it.
Well, I think...
Okay, guys, sorry, but we really have to move on. So there will be more questions later on. There will be a lot of opportunity to ask
maybe
questions.
if you... Okay, so let's define it shortly.
All right, shortly, please.
Okay. I think that the moment when you kind of, I have a hard time to kind of describe it in English. Let's say, that you kind of go over a boundary that kind of neglects the freedom of the opposite, well, gender or whatsoever. So that's toxic masculinity, and that you kind of have.
But that would also be toxic femininity.
Well, may I like finish my sentence,
Sure.
please? Thank you. And then also, I lost my sentence now. But no, I will be back. I'm back. But more in the sense that. Yeah, can someone help me here in the audience?
Okay, so before we move on, let me point something out. You know, that I was willing to undertake this line of discussion, allowing for the possibility that the category of toxic masculinity had some content, right? But if we're going to pursue that line of reasoning and quibble about the answer, then we're certainly going to quibble about the definition that's embedded in the question. And so part of what's happened in our discourse is that we're required ethically to assume a priori, merely out of politeness, that the utterance toxic masculinity actually constitutes a meaningful phrase. And if you push it, you find very rapidly that it doesn't, because it's very, very, very difficult to define, and definitions actually matter. And so if it's a matter of transgressing against the boundaries of gender-appropriate behavior, well, first of all, that indicates that there's something universal and normative about gender-appropriate behavior, which is something that people who push the idea of toxic masculinity generally tend not to presume. And second, it's just as likely to happen among women as among men, in which case it's not toxic masculinity. So maybe on to the next question.
Okay. Okay, so you have freedom of speech, and you often express that you're very much against political correctness. So how I would define that is putting societal boundaries on free speech. Would you just, can I continue? Is that a good definition of political correctness in your opinion?
No.
Okay, how would you define it?
Well, political correctness is something that I see as having been primarily formulated in the early 1970s. I think it's a unholy marriage, so to speak, between Marxism and postmodernism. And I've been criticized for that view because people say, well, it can't be a marriage between postmodernism and Marxism because postmodernism is predicated on skepticism towards meta-narratives and Marxism is a meta-narrative, so obviously there can't be any postmodern Marxists. And my reply to that is, well, yes, clearly that's the case from the perspective of pure coherence, but that doesn't seem to matter because there are plenty of postmodern Marxists. And that's not my problem because I can't distinguish between them conceptually, it's just the manner in which things have laid themselves out. It was a movement that was primarily a consequence of activity among French intellectuals in the early 70s, and to me it was in part a consequence of two things. It was a consequence of the demise of the intellectual and moral credibility of Marxism, especially in the aftermath of the revelations of the Stalinist and Maoist atrocities that characterized much of the 20th century. So that was one of the what would you call motivating factors, because all the people who held those Marxist viewpoints had to find another avenue of expression for their ideological commitments. And but then the second one, and this is a deeper one, is that there has been a very troublesome epistemological problem that's emerged in multiple fields since the early 1960s, in artificial intelligence and in psychology and in literary criticism. And the problem is attendant on the discovery that there's a virtually infinite number of ways of categorizing a finite number of objects. And so what that means is this is integrally tied in, for example, with the difficulty that AI pioneers had in producing machines that could perceive the world, because we thought that the world was made out of sort of discriminable objects in their self-evident categories, and that was just there for the perceiving, and that turned out to be seriously wrong. And so the postmodernist types ran across this problem. They thought, well, how many interpretations are there of a Shakespeare play? And the answer is innumerable interpretations. And then the next problem is, well, then how do you rank order those innumerable interpretations in terms of quality? And that's a major problem. And so political correctness is, well, those are its sources, but it turns out, practically speaking, that it's an amalgam of a rather nihilistic strain of postmodernism with a rather desperate strain of Marxism. So.
Okay, thank you. But I wanted to talk about either not regulating free speech at all and putting some societal boundaries on.
Well, there already are legal boundaries on free speech.
Of course, yeah. But for example, in the
Yeah,
US,
they're good enough.
there are very little. But
Yeah.
let me look together with you to an example. If, for example, in the 2016 elections with Donald Trump, there was a lot of. It's proven that there was some fake news and some hate speech circulating on those platforms, which was not actually true, and it reached a lot of people.
Yeah.
Would you and Facebook and Twitter are now regulating those posts?
No, they're trying to regulate them.
Yeah, they're trying to regulate them. So would you be in favor of regulating that, or would you say don't regulate at all?
Good luck to Twitter and Facebook regulating their content.
Okay.
Good luck to them, man. They've bitten off something that they'll never swallow.
Yeah.
So
So
who's going to regulate it? So look, am I in favor of a system that would ensure that all we ever received from the media was truth? Sure. If such a system could be produced, but I don't think for a second that that's even vaguely possible, even technically possible. It's like, who decides?
But the alternative is...
No, but it doesn't matter what the alternative is. The question is, who decides? It's the only question.
No, but I do agree with you, that's very difficult to decide that, but...
It's not difficult.
It's impossible, you would say.
And there's a big difference between difficult and impossible. And then what happens is, those who choose to regulate end up being precisely those who you would not want to regulate. Now, the way we solved that problem in the West was, you can say your stupid thing, and I can say my stupid thing, and all these people who are just as biased and ignorant as the two of us can listen, and we can all come to our determination about what constitutes truth. And that's the best we're ever going to be able to do. And I believe that. And I don't see any improvement on that.
Okay. What do you think the role of the individual is now that we're living in a world with different groups and different conditions? How would you see the role of the individual in society in the future? Are you optimistic about it?
Yes, fundamentally. And the reason I'm optimistic is partly because I'm very deeply pessimistic by nature. And I've looked at a very large number of terrible things, both in my studies and in my personal life and in my private practice. And my conclusion has been that despite the vast ocean of ignorance that we all swim in and the overwhelming proclivity for malevolence that characterizes the human psyche, that the nobility that's part and parcel of us and the potential can transcend that and defeat it. And so it's very dark, but there's something very bright at the bottom. And so I'm very optimistic about that, and that's part of the reason that that I wrote the book that I wrote, but also that I'm touring around the world, talking to people about adopting something approximating a vision that's noble and worthy, and setting their speech straight, and getting their lives together, and shouldering the responsibility of the world in a manner that's good for them and their family and their communities, and to think about that as an aspirational goal that provides them with the meaning to offset the tragedy of their life. And I believe that's solid, right to the core. And my impression is that it's that knowing that, hearing that, which is something that all people already know in some sense, but hearing that articulated clearly is of great utility to people. And every time someone comes up to me, and this happens very often, multiple times a day, no matter where I am, and someone comes up to me and says, excuse me, are you Dr. Peterson? And they usually say that very politely, and they're apologetic for disturbing me, even though they're not disturbing me. They say, look, I was having a rough time a couple of years ago, addicted, alcoholic, lonesome, disturbed in my personal relationships. I've been watching your lectures, listening to your books, listening to your podcasts. Things are much better. Thank you. It's like every time that happens, it's overwhelming. I'm sorry, it always breaks me up, but it's very overwhelming. You see, it's very overwhelming to have strangers come up and tell you things that they won't tell people that are close to them. You know, it indicates that they trust, that there's a trust there, that's a deep trust, because the people who are doing this, they come up and tell me that because they're very pleased about it, but also because they know that I'll be pleased about it. And I am overwhelmingly pleased about it. And so, and for me, every time I hear something like that, that's a victory. You know, I studied the structure of totalitarianism for a very long time and became a very firm believer in the idea of good and evil. And I do believe that the most appropriate way to conceptualize the nature of human experience is as a battle between good and evil. And I think it's a very serious battle because the evil is very dark and very terrible. And every time I see someone who has reoriented themselves in an upward direction, then I regard that as part of what defeats that terrible malevolence and bitterness. And I believe that the fundamental doctrine that each individual is a center of creation, I believe that to be literally and metaphorically true. And I also believe that each of us participate in the process of transforming what could be into what is, and that we do that as a consequence of our ethical choices, and that we shape the world as a consequence of that. And so then when I hear someone come up to me and say, look, you know, I've done everything I could in the last while to put myself together, and it's much less dark around me, I think. That's one more major victory on the bitter road uphill. So.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much.
This is a kind of a topic, but as a Jungian, as a psychologist, what kind of archetypes would you say President Trump has in him, or does he represent?
Well, there's a bit of the fool, and I'm being dead serious, like, because he's got a trickster element to him, eh? So, and you can see that by the way he plays on Twitter. And he's bombastic, and he's certainly an entertainer, so he's highly, highly extroverted. So there's a public performer element to him. And, you know, from the Jungian perspective, the fool is a precursor to the savior, right? Because the fool is often the only person who can tell the truth. And I think that one of the things that happened in the last presidential election is that people regarded Trump, not everyone obviously, and only a tiny majority of people, but many people regarded Trump as more honest than Clinton because his foolish, impulsive lies were more trustworthy than her carefully scripted, ideologically planned lies. So, and I'm dead serious about that. Like, there's something about his uncontrollable, relatively uncontrollable impulsivity that reveals him in a way that someone who's all persona, which was certainly the case with Clinton and her teams of persona constructors, they never let the real person out. Same thing happened with Al Gore in election, you know, a couple of cycles before that. And so I think people, given those choices, they went for the trickster. And so that's the archetype I would see at work there. Now there's also some devouring mother, tyrannical father dynamic that played out in the last election as well. And so, you know, a critic of Trump would consider him a tyrannical father, and a critic of Clinton would consider her a devouring mother. And I think that the electorate also tilted slightly towards preferring the devouring trickster father to the persona compassionate or the tyrannical trickster father rather than the devouring, compassionate mother. But it was, you know, it was a knife edge. It was a knife edge.
Yes.
A very well prepared
Thank
question.
you.
Yep.
You've mentioned the word ethics a couple of times, therefore this question. Can you define what you personally find of intrinsic value that should be part of an objective debate where we find a decent balance between tolerance and the freedom of speech? Well, can I continue? I want to keep it short. And I mean, can you mention one simple element that we perhaps need at this moment to that we could to not oversee, that is really crucial to this objective debate? And can we also go beyond the notion of left and right? Because we tend to describe and mention these aspects of the political spectrum, but it is very vague.
Well, as I said, most of what I'm doing, as far as I'm concerned, isn't left versus right. It's something other than that. And the only reason I got involved in political issues in Canada to begin with was because I thought that the politicians overstepped the political boundary and entered into a different realm, and that was a realm that I happened to hold rather dear. And so that was cast as a political issue, but for me it wasn't. It was a philosophical or even a theological issue. Now, with regards to free speech, I mean, for me, the issue is quite clear. Is there such a thing as hate speech? Well, you have to be a bloody fool if you don't think there's such a thing as hate speech. I mean, I'm sure many of you have uttered hate speech when you're having a vicious argument with someone that you love. I mean, people say hateful things all the time. That's not the issue. The issue is, what do you do about it? And the answer is, well, you let the utterances play themselves out in the public domain. And the reason for that is because there isn't a better solution. It's not because there's no hatred, but it's also the case. It's also the case that defining hatred is a very tricky business, and who's going to define it is even a trickier business. And you know, like in Scotland now, the police have posters up in the subways asking Scotsmen and Scotswomen to turn each other into the police if they say something offensive. It's like, well, good luck thinking without being offensive. I mean, look at it this way. If you don't have a problem, you don't have to think, because you don't have a problem. If you have a problem, then you have a problem, and it varies in severity. And so let's say you have a serious problem. Well, if you have a serious problem, it's going to be emotionally engaging. It's really going to matter to you how the problem is formulated and solved. It's actually going to matter. And so then you produce a diversity of opinions about the problem and how to solve it, because you need a diversity of opinions, because you have a problem and you want to solve it, but because it's emotionally engaging, you're going to find a certain number of the opinions distasteful, even hateful. Okay, well, fair enough, but how are you going to protect yourself against that and still be able to think? And you might say, well, you don't need to think, which seems to be the default conclusion. It's like, good luck with that. Why do you have to think? You have to think because that's how you simulate the world. And so you simulate the world through thinking. You play out the consequences of a particular pattern of action. If the consequences are negative, then you don't embody the pattern of action. Then you don't die. So the reason that you think is so that you don't die. And if you're going to think about contentious things, then it's going to be offensive, terribly offensive. You're going to get the full range. And sometimes you're going to be wrong about being offended. It's like, you're wrong, seriously. And this thing you find so offensive, it's exactly what you need to correct your viewpoint. And that happens to people all the time in their life. You all know that. You know perfectly well that there are periods of time where you had to undergo a painful, radical psychological transformation for your own good. And the way that you managed that was to learn something extremely bitter and distasteful. And if someone would have asked you, even while it was occurring, is this something you want to know? Are you happy about being exposed to it? The answer would be most definitively no, because it leads you down into that state of disintegration that's necessary before you put yourself back together. And the right to be offensive is absolutely indistinguishable from the right to think. And so you interfere with that at your peril, especially as a consequence of like well-meaning compassion that's mostly aimed at minimizing short-term conflict. It's just, it's not, there's nothing in that that's going to have a positive outcome. All we'll get is polite people who say nothing offensive, who can't think or produce art or anything of value, and who can't solve problems, and who avoid short-term conflict at all cost. And that's not a society I want to live in. So, and it's not a society that's going to have much of a lifespan in front of it. So.
Okay. Let's do, yeah.